system. So, yeah, it's just, again, it's logical to do it that way. And so we absolutely would support flexible education models.
And then the other big one around education for VCOSS is around affordability. So we've still got a very strong connection between the income of a household and the educational outcomes of a student. So in terms of breaking that connection so that children that have got that capacity and ability from whatever background, we've got a whole range of affordability issues there and cost factors. So what are the sorts of perspectives that brings?
TAFE fees is the first one we'd be looking at. TAFE fees should be abolished. I'm just quite astounded by the government bringing in these extraordinary TAFE fees. I grew up in Morwell, so postcode determinant. I left school when I was 16. I've lived all my adult life in Footscray. Went to university when I was 40, did the community development course. If the fees had existed then for that course, I could never have done that course. There were so many women in my course who were there as a means of escaping poverty. You know, so we have to take away the TAFE fees. It's just crazy. We need to be looking at fees in primary and high schools too. And it's not just the fees, it's the books, it's the uniforms, it's children's inability to go on camp. So we need to look at how we make sure that kids have the opportunities that all children have, and it's a particularly important issue.
Thank you. Now, as you might imagine, when we're talking about community services, VCOSS has got members who are running all sorts of services.
And I think I've probably just about met everybody in the last 4 years, and it's been one of the great things about this job is that I have come across the most phenomenal ideas and plans. But I also have to say that there are times when I've been in these meetings when I get a bit terrified because the knowledge in the room is so huge, and I just feel a bit humbled by that.
Oh well, you're in Parliament and the sector's outside, so we'll keep talking to you,
absolutely.
I'm sure. Now, one of the sorts of broad issues and themes, of course, is that we've talked about before is the sort of pressures, the demand pressures. So maybe if we kick off with talking a little bit about disability and disability services, there's quite a push on, and we've got the two major parties both support the national push towards a national disability insurance scheme. So what's your perspective on the NDIS?
We absolutely support it. What concerns me though is, having done a number of disability forums over the last few weeks, is that the two main parties are seeing that as, you know, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, but it could take 5-10 years to put in place. And so does that mean we just ignore all the needs now? And that is really starting to trouble me, that the governments will just use it as an excuse to not roll out the other services. And we obviously still need services until that time, and we actually need more rather than less.
And how would you approach some of the big demand for services? And we've got disability accommodation, we've got big waiting lists, carers respite, mental health carers and mental health demand itself, and for disability services we've had a number of price reviews and a number of programs which have not been adequately priced yet. How would you approach your set of priorities around these issues?
Accommodation is obviously one of the major issues at the moment, and especially for ageing carers who are in their 80s and their children are in their 50s. These issues are pretty obvious. We have a huge urgent waiting list, but we also obviously have a very invisible waiting list of people whose situation is not deemed urgent but really do need care. In the West, we have a particular problem with respite care, that families might be getting a weekend every 12 months of respite care, and this is because families have been forced to relinquish their children. They're literally going to the respite house on Friday, refusing to collect their child on Sunday. Now, the amount of heartbreak that must cause for a family to actually get to that situation is beyond my... I just can't comprehend how difficult that must be. So so it would be accommodation, it would be education, it would be access to transport, and just access to what every other child has in their daily life, that they shouldn't be excluded from activities because they have a disability, and the support for the family so that the family doesn't break down.
Yeah. I've got quite a specific one here. Maria Bowen from Carers Victorian, talking about housing and support for people with disabilities. What would the Greens do to pressure government to address the needs of the 1,239 people on the disability support register urgently requiring accommodation and support?
What we would be doing about, because, you know, let's be honest, we're not going to be government. We are very good at advocating and campaigning with the sector to make sure that this happens. This is a particular issue I have no intentions of letting go. And what I find particularly disturbing about this list is it's the urgent list. What about all the other people as well who really need assistance too? The government is everything that I'm seeing in terms of budget. There's just no building going on. There's no thought to how they're going to create more homes for people. There's no ideas about how some people who are currently in accommodation will probably be supported reasonably well in the community on their own, and looking at the needs of everybody and getting away from this one size fits all for accommodation and care. It's just not working.
Now, Sandra Hill, CEO of Benetas, says, with an increasing number of older Victorians living in their own homes for longer, we are also witnessing an increasing number of older Victorians who are socially isolated. How will the Greens tackle this issue, and can you outline a social inclusion policy specifically for older Victorians? And how will you approach age discrimination in the workplace?
Right, two great questions. My previous job was working in an office of housing high-rise in Williamstown for older residents, and social inclusion was one of the prime parts of that program. And one of the best things we ever did was the community garden. And again, it is simple things. It's not often expensive. It takes a bit of imagination and often quite a bit of work, but it's also giving people an alternative to the pokies, as that's their leisure activity. So again, it's one that I've had some experience in. I'm really keen to work on, and I'm keen to get the sector's idea about what are the things that work best. I know from my experience what I saw worked, but I'm sure there are 1,000 other ideas out there. But social inclusion is really important. And obviously too, people are staying in their homes longer. There are issues around, they may be asset rich, but they're income poor. How do you address those issues as well? Older people now, in terms of concessions, that we have to change the whole thing around the summer concession rates, because they need to be able to use their air conditioning. And so there's a whole package of things that have to be done for older people.
Okay.
And I've never figured out how you can stop people discriminating against those, people over 21. It's just, I don't get it. People have knowledge, strength and wisdom, and they're logical people to be employed.
Okay, housing. Next topic.
Yes.
So we're particularly interested in rental housing. The majority of low-income households live in rental housing, often paying more than 30% of their income on rent. What would the Greens do for renters and/or housing more generally?
Yes. Obviously, the issue around renters is that it's no longer, it shouldn't be acceptable to just give rental assistance to people who are on benefit. We need to look at whether that next group of people who are in employment but whose income is very low, whether they should also be getting rental assistance. We need to be building a whole lot more social and public housing, and we need to get away from this monstrous idea that some people have that social or public housing is where, I get really shocked by the way some people describe social and public housing, that the people who live in them are really dangerous and mean and whatever. I grew up in a housing commission house. I don't have two heads. I'm a perfectly rational person. And we have to also break down that stereotype about who lives in public and social housing, and the government should commit to building a lot more of this kind of housing. But look at the models. Some people want a one-bedroom flat. Some people are going to need a 4-bedroom house. Again, it's the one-size-fits-all. and looking at the work that bigger urban does and making sure when the big developments happen that part of the requirement is 10, 15 or 20% of that housing be for people on a fixed income.
Okay, thank you. Now, we're moving into cause, not consequences. It relates to violence in the community.
Yep.
We've had a range of questions from our members around this to ask the different parties.
Yes.
So starting off with family violence, we've had a question that Danny Blay from Motor Violence logged, which is that there's been a strong focus by the Victorian Government on the prevention of family violence over the last few years, but there's been a gross underestimate of the impact of spiralling demand for services. The bulk of Victoria's men's behaviour change programs are unable to cope with the current demand, and in Melbourne's northwest, all 6 DHS-funded programs are full. And then, of course, the same applies in terms of services and programs available for victims of violence in terms of primarily women and children. Workers are leaving the sector because of the demand, and what it does is create an increasing risk of ongoing violence due to the lack of opportunities to engage men in responses. So, just quite broadly, how does the Greens see these issues around demand for services and the family violence reforms more generally?
I think it's an odd quandary that this government has actually been extremely good on the issues about family violence and putting it out there, but they haven't funded the services that are actually required to make sure that it stops. We've had a situation with the Bridbank domestic family violence unit that was actually closed. Now, they had a really good relationship with the agencies working in the area, but it's closed. And then, the men's behaviour groups not being able to get enough funding. We need to be looking at how we stop family violence, not just how we talk about it. And we can only really stop it if we fund the organisations that are obviously doing the work on the ground and are being really effective.
Okay. Now the next one is from Georgie Ferrari from Youth Affairs Council, but it's talking about the Smart Justice campaign, which is being run by the Federation of Community Legal Centres. The question is really around how Victorians are being made to feel as though we're living in a crime-ridden, dangerous place, whereas in fact the overall crime rate per head of population has dropped by 30% over the last decade. Knife crime has dropped, assaults with knives are down, robberies with knives are down, significantly down. Given that Victoria is the safest state in Australia, how would you take oxygen away from law and order in favour of dealing with the causes, not the consequences of criminality?
This has been a terrible campaign for law and order. I don't find Melbourne particularly unsafe. I catch trains at night, I catch buses at night, I walk around Footscray, I walk around the CBD. Admittedly, I'm not in King Street at 3 o'clock in the morning. So let's maybe look at alcohol and how freely available alcohol is. Let's look at the cause and effect of violence rather than just the kind of campaign, the fear campaign. Sometimes I think when I hear the major parties that I'm living in Beirut, I'm not. It's actually a good city. There are problems, I'm not denying that, but I think too that when the government rushed through the stop and search provisions, the Greens voted against that quite clearly. You've taken all those police away from duties that they could have been doing to have this nice PR thing on railway stations. Has it had any effect? I don't think so. We actually need staff on railway stations. We need lighting on railway stations. We need stations that operate, a 10-minute timetable. They're the kinds of things that we need. And we need more visible police on the beat. We actually don't need police with more powers.
Thank you.